May 29th, 1453. The city that for centuries was considered eternal is drowning in its own blood and the ambition of another. History has a sick sense of irony. The most impenetrable fortress in the Christian world wasn't brought down by ancient gods or mythical titans. It was cold-bloodedly wiped off the map by a 21-year-old upstart. He was obsessed with the idea of absolute world domination and massive siege engines. And while those ancient walls crumbled under the methodical pounding of Ottoman artillery, enlightened Europe just sat there and watched. Great rulers turned tail. They naively prayed that the hungry beast would choke on this first, fattest piece. They hadn't yet realized the ultimate, lethal paradox. An empire is never full. It only works up an appetite with every new victim. Constantinople was gutted by that ambitious youth, Mehmed. He didn't just seize a wealthy city, he performed a flawless, brutal surgical strike to rip the heart out of the old world. The streets are choked with the wreckage of someone else's pride and shattered icons. The value of a human life plummeted to zero instantly. Imagine being there, standing on those smoking ruins, breathing in that sweet, sickening stench of rot. What would you feel? Could you keep your head? You watch as the victors efficiently herd the survivors off to slave markets. No rage, no animalistic fury, just business. By the hundreds of thousands. This wasn't some wild, disorganized horde of nomads. That was the real, paralyzing horror of it. This was a cutting-edge industrial killing machine. Bureaucrats with scimitars, pedantic scribes with cold calculation logging newly conquered provinces, tons of looted gold, and millions of broken lives into their fat ledgers. As a shell-shocked witness to those monstrous days, a Byzantine historian wrote, "The city has fallen, yet for some reason I am still alive, and there is no longer any point in drawing breath." Those words are soaked in absolute despair, and that despair spread across the continent like a wildfire. Europe froze in primal terror, submissively waiting its turn. Venetian merchants dropped their goblets in a panic. The Pope sent out desperate, completely useless calls for a crusade. Everyone suddenly realized the brutal truth. Their quaint knightly ideals and heavy steel armor were nothing but flimsy foil against the mathematically precise, massive power of the Sultan's army. But that's where the fatal error in judgment lay. The main blunder of old Europe's leaders was their naive faith. They believed they could cut a deal with this machine, that a purchased peace guaranteed survival. Meanwhile, the Ottoman steamroller was relentlessly grinding through the Balkans, proving the absolute futility of hope. States were wiped off the map faster than terrified cartographers could mix fresh ink. Strike. Pause. Strike. Bastions snapped like dry twigs. Old Europe was shrinking, paralyzed by fear, turning its defiant defenders into dead men walking. Those who tried to resist honestly realized the pointlessness of their efforts all too quickly. The punishment was always exemplary, high-tech, completely devoid of human emotion. The Sultan didn't revel in revenge. He was simply optimizing the cleared space for his empire. Look at an anonymous Serbian peasant in that decisive moment. For a second, be him. Your knees are sinking into the sticky, cold spring mud. Your home is roaring in flames behind you. The icy, razor-sharp steel of a janissary blade softly brushes your neck. There's no rage left in your eyes for the enemy. Only an all-consuming, crushing void remains. There, a crystal-clear realization rings out. The heavens are deaf to your prayers today. This ruthless, inevitable methodicalness broke yesterday's proud rulers from the inside out. Men who just yesterday swore to stand to the death suddenly found 1,000 logical reasons to surrender. Primal fear turned kings into spineless vassals. They crawled on their knees into Mehmed's campaign tent, humiliated. They kissed the hem of his silk robe. They voluntarily handed over their own children as hostages. All for the ghost of an illusion of personal safety. All for one more day of life, soaked in shame. Some built high walls to keep death out. Others bought truces to delay it. But everything proved useless against the absolute pragmatism of the aggressor. By the end of the 1460s, no one had any illusions left. The sun had finally burned away any hope of a miracle. Mehmed II had calmly digested the legacy of Rome. The empire's pulse steadied. It regrouped its countless iron-clad legions and raised its heavy gaze once more. That greedy, calculating stare slowly turned north, toward the murky, cold waters of the wide Danube, where the thick, unwelcoming thickets began. Toward forest-bound Moldavia. While the empire was busy digesting the remains of great kingdoms on the southern bank of the Danube, a suffocating political darkness was thickening on the northern shore. Look at a map of 15th century Eastern Europe. This isn't a boring geography textbook. It's a detailed blueprint of a massive, heartless meat grinder. Right in the center sits a tiny forest country, dirt-poor, muddy Moldavia. It looks like a doomed pawn on a blood-soaked chessboard. Around it, 4 giant, greedy queens are baring their teeth. The massive Ottoman Empire is pressing hard from the south. The arrogant Kingdom of Hungary is gnashing its steel teeth to the west. To the east, a cunning Poland has spread its long tentacles. And from the north, the ruthless Tatar hordes are rolling in. Every one of these states dreams of swallowing this pathetic scrap of land. This wasn't some shining land worth a knight's death. It was a poverty-stricken territory. Dense, impassable thickets, knee-deep, sticky mud. There were no grand marble palaces here, no glittering gold being pulled from deep mines. But Moldavia was the perfect, straight corridor for foreign armies. It was the master key to controlling the entire restless region. Life here had long ago turned into an endless, grueling process of survival. Think about it for a second. How far would you go to save your own home? For the ghost of an illusion of independence? Could you shake the hand of a man whose soldiers just scattered your family to the wind, all while wearing a polite smile? Could you call a murderer your brother? The local rulers did it every day. Hardcore survival demanded absolute, unprincipled political prostitution. The stench of foul betrayal was thicker here than the cold morning mist. Imagine yourself as a low-ranking Moldavian envoy. Your damp hands nervously twitch at the edge of your cheap wool cloak. You're standing in the vast, gilded hall of some powerful foreign king. You need to sell your country's loyalty, and fast. Sell it so your sworn enemies can't buy it first. You weigh every syllable. One wrong, careless word, one betraying muscle twitch on your face. And tomorrow, your home village will be burned to the ground by the fast-moving, punitive squads of an ally who suddenly took offense. You silently sign the humiliating treaty. The quill scratches against the parchment. You know for a fact you'll break this oath in a month's time. No noble honor, no sacred vows. Just the cold sweat of fear and the sickening dance between the sharp fangs of predators. Diplomacy in this cursed place was scarier than open warfare. In a brutal fight, at least you see your enemy's twisted face. In the dark Moldavian palaces, the poisoned dagger always came from your best, most trusted friend. Legitimate rulers changed with a kaleidoscopic, terrifying speed. Yesterday's exile became today's prince. Brother killed brother without a second thought. A caring uncle cold-bloodedly poisoned his nephew. Every new terrified puppet on the throne swore eternal loyalty to a strong master. The Ottomans were paid regularly in heavy gold. The Hungarians were submissively paid in choice grain. The Poles were generously paid in empty promises. This twisted, endless game of survival was rapidly sucking the country dry. The common folk paid for their neighbors' ambitions and their master's weakness with their own blood. Every 2 years, a foreign, hungry army would descend on these defenseless lands. The soldiers didn't care who was right. They just efficiently took everything edible. They drove off the livestock. They turned blooming valleys into smoking wastelands. After 10 years of this feverish paranoia, the country looked like a picked-over skeleton thrown out into the frost. The state was literally bursting at its rotten seams. No one believed in a saving grace tomorrow anymore. Peasants silently buried their meager bread in deep pits. Wealthy boyars scrambled to hide their gold behind the thick walls of monasteries. The constant, exhausting wait for inevitable death became the background noise for every inhabitant. As one anonymous contemporary put it, "We are born with a noose around our necks, and every neighbor is trying to pull it tighter." The words of foreign generals sounded just as cynical. They openly admitted Moldavia was nothing more than a convenient bargaining chip, a sacrificial lamb on the altar of high politics. It was a perfect, closed loop of despair. The cage had snapped shut. It seemed this people was doomed to forever grovel in the mud under the heavy boots of great empires. But it was precisely in this toxic atmosphere of absolute claustrophobia and total, daily betrayal that a completely new type of leader was being invisibly forged. Someone who would one day understand the brutal rules of the game far better than the aggressive predators themselves. Enough of being a submissive, spineless victim. If you're surrounded by rabid, hungry dogs, you can't bleat like a frightened sheep. You have to become the scariest, most cold-blooded wolf in this dark forest. You have to break the very board they're playing on. And this young wolf was already watching the bloody chaos closely. He was quietly sharpening his fangs in the deep shadows of neighboring Wallachia. There, his older cousin and primary mentor in the dark political arts ruled with an iron fist. A man whose name alone would soon make all of enlightened Europe nervously cross themselves. Vlad the Impaler. The lessons of a genius butcher were patiently waiting for their diligent, cold-hearted student, and Stephen intended to learn those terrible lessons by heart. In the spring of 1457, the deceptive silence of the Moldavian valleys was shattered by hoarse screams. Stephen had come for his crown. He didn't beg European monarchs for help. He didn't weave elegant Byzantine intrigues. He simply brought in hungry Wallachian mercenary infantry. Strike. Mud kicked up thick under the iron-shod hooves of war horses. Period. The blood of a ruling relative generously stained the oak throne. The previous ruler, a cowardly schemer named Peter Aaron, fled across the border with his tail between his legs. Stephen stepped toward his coveted power, literally over the still warm bodies of his enemies. It was dirty. It was absolutely ruthless. It was incredibly effective. The young ruler looked at the terrified crowd of surviving boyars with the cold, unblinking stare of a predator. His older cousin had given him a magnificent practical masterclass, the science of total terror. Vlad loved impaling people on long stakes, entire forests of rotting, groaning bodies. Black crows lazily pecking out the eyes of former allies. Stephen took very careful notes on this bloody methodology. With mathematical precision, he purged the internal opposition. The heads of arrogant aristocrats rolled by the dozens. Heavy wooden chopping blocks were soaked in the thick, sticky blood of traitors. The bureaucracy of death began to run like a Swiss watch. Those who stood in his way were cut down, entire ancient lineages wiped out. Tired executioners complained monotonously about their axes dulling too fast. No Christian mercy, no rotten compromises. Fear instantly encased Moldavia in an icy shell. Just a year after the coronation, the country stood in a paralyzed stupor. Imagine yourself as an old, incredibly high-ranking boyar in that dark era. Slip into his expensive sable coat for a second. For centuries, you've changed weak-willed rulers like dirty gloves. You're absolutely certain of your own untouchable status. Suddenly, in the dead of night, the massive oak door of your bedroom is kicked in with a deafening crash. Blinding light from pitch torches hits your face. The smell of burnt resin and someone else's sweat fills your lungs. A mercenary's heavy, iron-shod boot brutally pins your chest to the icy stone floor. Your wife's desperate scream pierces your ears. You gasp for stale air. Panic grips your throat like a vice. And you realize clearly, your heavy chests of silver don't mean a damn thing anymore. Your diplomatic connections are dead. The new master doesn't take gold bribes. He only takes lives. A cold, perfectly sharpened blade confidently touches your trembling Adam's apple. Darkness. But Stephen wasn't just another bloodthirsty maniac on the throne. He was a crystal-clear thinker, a brilliant sociopath. He very quickly realized the fatal limitations of his Wallachian mentor's methods. Blind, theatrical cruelty is a cheap street performance. It's great for scaring downtrodden peasants and cowardly petty schemers, but it will never stop a heavy imperial machine. As the ruler himself put it to a tight circle of confidants, fear makes a yard dog whimper and obey. But only absolute, insane calculation makes a seasoned wolf back down. True, undeniable power isn't the simple physical ability to kill your subjects. It's the icy, paranoid understanding of exactly what maximum price the enemy is willing to pay for your head. And the readiness to make that price unbearable. Stephen stopped being a common feudal thug. He evolved. He transformed into a pragmatic, ruthless architect of national survival. He began hastily building massive stone fortresses. They shot up like steel spikes on the country's vulnerable body. He did the unthinkable. He armed the common, dirt-poor peasants. Wooden pitchforks, heavy scythes, and tight bows against shining imperial steel. He created a perfect, tight-knit police state, locked together by a single paranoid idea of survival in a ring of enemies. He knew for a fact that his predatory neighbors would eventually try to test his new teeth. The Kingdom of Hungary made the first move. They decided to teach the arrogant upstart a lesson. King Matthias Corvin brought an elite, heavy-duty army. They came to loot and punish. But Stephen didn't play at noble knightly tournaments on a flat, open field. He cold-bloodedly lured their heavy-armored horsemen into a narrow, tight gorge. He methodically snapped their steel spine. The earth was soaked deep with foreign blood. The arrogant king barely escaped under the cover of night, carrying 3 deep wounds from Moldavian arrows. Stephen showed his sharp fangs to all of haughty Europe. He proved beyond a doubt that his forest fortress now bit back to the death. But that was just a light, warm-up exercise. The real test was patiently waiting its turn. Stephen understood perfectly well that he had only fended off a common, greedy wolf. But to the south, across the wide bed of the Danube, a giant, perpetually hungry bear was already waking up. The Ottoman Empire never forgave defiance. Sultan Mehmed II methodically ground to powder anyone who dared look him straight in the eye. And the Moldavian prince made an absolutely paradoxical, insane decision. Instead of sitting quietly in the safety of the shadows and submissively paying gold tribute, he decided to strike first. He decided to spit in the face of death itself. The spit in the face of death happened in the winter of 1473. Stephen stopped paying the tribute. 3,000 heavy gold ducats. A pittance for a massive empire. A massive price for a ghost of peace for a dirt-poor Moldavia. But the golden stream suddenly dried up. Imperial tax collectors returned to the capital empty-handed. But that wasn't enough. The Moldavian prince moved to the active phase of his suicidal plan. He brazenly invaded Wallachian territory. This neighboring land had always been considered a sacred zone of Ottoman influence. Stephen brutally kicked out the submissive sultan's governor. He cold-bloodedly installed his own puppet on the throne. This wasn't just a local border skirmish. This was a deafening, ringing slap to the face of the great conqueror. No one in their right mind dared to humiliate the sublime Porte like that. Enlightened Europe gasped in awe. Foreign courts immediately wrote Stephen off as a noble madman. They loudly praised his desperate, knightly courage. But let's strip away that hypocritical, romantic garbage right now. In realpolitik, there's no room for pretty, meaningless gestures. Stephen was definitely not a naive idealist in shining armor. He was a cold, paranoid pragmatist. His lightning invasion of Wallachia wasn't a spontaneous explosion of rage. It was a carefully calculated, mathematical provocation. He understood the relentless logic of empire perfectly. The Sultan physically could not ignore such a blatant challenge. Mehmed was forced to respond as harshly and publicly as possible. Otherwise, other subject nations would immediately smell blood and weakness. Stephen was deliberately drawing all the fire onto himself. He was building a massive, invisible trap. He needed the full weight of the empire's power in one single place. The news reached warm Istanbul with startling speed. Mehmed II's rage was absolutely silent. He didn't scream at his advisors. He didn't hurl gold goblets at the walls. He just slowly nodded to his Grand Vizier. That slight, barely noticeable gesture immediately triggered a monstrous mechanism. The bureaucratic machine of death groaned into motion. The empire began efficiently assembling its invincible iron legions. Piercing war horns sounded across the vast territory. Riders flew to the most distant provinces. Orders were written in bone-dry, clerical language. No personal hatred for a distant enemy, just cold, ruthless numbers. So many thousands of heavy infantry, so many hundreds of bronze cannons, tons of black powder, miles of musket fuses. Look at this through the eyes of a common Ottoman quartermaster. Slip into his dusty, embroidered robe for a minute. You're sitting in a sweltering campaign tent, smelling of horse sweat. Your fingers have long since turned black from stained ink. You monotonously scratch a long goose quill across rough parchment. You don't see the soldiers' faces. To you, they're just faceless units in long columns. You pedantically calculate daily rations of hard jerked meat. You count heavy sacks of forage for the cavalry. Your math is perfect. You know for a fact, to grind a rebellious country into gray ash, it will take exactly 120,000 hungry mouths. Your routine bookkeeping is a death sentence for an entire people. You press the heavy final seal onto the document. It's just standard preparation for a scheduled annihilation. By the end of 1474, the iron fist was fully forged. 120,000 men, a colossal figure that defied the comprehension of terrified contemporaries. This wasn't an army, it was an unstoppable force of nature, a massive, pulsing organism of sharpened steel, taut muscle, and blind obedience. The elite Janissary Corps, heavy Rumelian cavalry, a motley infantry hungry for easy loot. They began their slow slog north. The damp earth groaned under their synchronized march. Thick dust from millions of hooves blotted out the sun. Mehmed entrusted this punitive expedition to his most ruthless commander. Suleiman Pasha knew no defeat. He carried a crystal-clear order: take no prisoners, conduct no negotiations, leave nothing of Moldavia but a flat, lifeless field. A terrifying, perfectly logical question arises: what was the Moldavian prince actually trying to achieve? Why provoke absolute evil if you lack the strength to defeat it? Stephen had barely 40,000 militiamen at his disposal, outnumbered 3 to 1. Destitute peasants armed with rusty scythes and old clubs against the most advanced military machine of the era. This doesn't look like a clever plan. It looks like clinical, incurable suicide. A leap into the abyss with eyes wide shut. But within this cold madness lay a frightening, twisted genius. Stephen knew the primary, hidden secret of great armies. Their colossal strength is always their fatal weakness. A gargantuan mass of armed men must be fed daily. It requires vast, level spaces for complex maneuvers. By provoking this massive, lumbering invasion, Stephen made the first move in his gruesome game of chess. The aggressor was certain of an easy, triumphal stroll. The Ottomans were long accustomed to breaking high stone walls and trampling glittering knights into the bloody mud of wide plains. They greedily anticipated a quick rout, mountains of loot, and hearty dinners in captured cities. None of these 120,000 confident men could suspect the terrible truth. They weren't marching to war. They were stepping in neat, beautiful ranks, straight into the devil's maw. To crush this steel juggernaut, Stephen was prepared to apply the ultimate measure. He was going to burn his own homeland. Burn his own homeland. Easy to say in a warm tent, unbearable to do in the freezing wind. Stephen harbored no illusions. He knew the harsh mathematics of war perfectly. In an honest clash on an open field, his tiny army would simply be trampled. The 120,000-strong Turkish horde would devour his militia in a single day. There is only one way to defeat a giant monster. You have to starve it to death. The Moldavian prince made the most terrible decision. He decided to cold-bloodedly offer his own people as a sacred sacrifice. The salvation of the state demanded an absolute void. Messengers rode frantically in all directions, carrying a death sentence for their native land. The order was brief: retreat to the high mountains, hide the grain, slaughter the extra livestock, burn your homes, poison every well. This wasn't a heroic defense. It was the industrial-scale liquidation of his own country. Yesterday's defenders turned into the executioners of their own people. Stephen's mounted detachments went from village to village, carrying smoking torches. They left behind nothing but a flat layer of gray ash. Imagine yourself in the shoes of a simple Moldavian peasant. Stand right there on your frozen plot of land. Your calloused hands grip a heavy branch. Fire greedily licks the dry wood. Before you stands your home. You built it over long years. Your children were born there. Your father died there. The cold December wind bites into a face wet with tears. The blunt tip of a guard's spear presses into your back. You have no choice. You slowly bring the flaming torch to the thatched roof. A flash. Heat hits your eyes. Thick smoke instantly fills your lungs. Your past life quickly turns to filthy ash. You watch the fire in silence. Something inside you snaps forever. You drive your terrified cow into the dark woods and walk away into the cold unknown. Who is the great ruler after this? The savior of the nation, or a ruthless butcher? Think about it. Could you sincerely love a leader who, for the greater good, stripped you of absolutely everything? History is incredibly hypocritical. It easily forgives winners of any sin. But then, in the frosty December of 1474, the common people quietly cursed their prince. They hated him with a fierce hatred, no less than the approaching Ottoman invaders. Their protector had turned them into homeless vagabonds. The price of survival proved exorbitant. The country was rapidly plunging into impenetrable darkness. While the last peasant huts burned out in the north, a new storm was brewing on the southern border. Suleiman Pasha's vanguard crossed the icy waters of the Danube. The Sultan's elite soldiers were full of arrogant confidence. They anticipated rich spoils. They dreamed of warm houses and full cellars. They were marching for a quick victory. Their war drums beat rhythmically, but they were met with a deafening silence. The Ottoman vanguard slowly drew into foreign territory. Joyful shouts quickly died down. Smiles slid off weathered faces. Before them lay a black wasteland. White snow was mixed with sticky ash. Not a single living soul remained. Only charred chimneys stuck out crookedly from the frozen earth, resembling the rotten teeth of a dead monster. The great imperial machine was used to feeding on foreign resources. It always moved forward, gluttonously devouring everything in its path. But here, there was absolutely nothing to eat. The land was dead. Exhausted soldiers rushed greedily to the deep village wells, desperate for a drink after the long march. They quickly hauled up heavy wooden buckets, but the water smelled nauseating. Bloated carcasses of dead dogs rotted at the dark bottom. Stephen hadn't left the enemy even a single gulp of clean water. It was a mathematically calculated vacuum. The invisible trap snapped shut. The invincible army found itself trapped in a frozen hell. There was no way back. Blind imperial pride would not allow Suleiman Pasha to retreat. Ahead lay only a scorched dead zone. A sharp winter wind howled in the bare branches. The temperature plummeted. The beautiful southern robes provided no warmth at all. The great army felt the sticky prick of primal fear for the first time. They realized one brutal truth. There would be no beautiful nightly battles here. The local ruler had proven to be an absolute pragmatist. To kill a foreign army, he had killed his own country with his own hands. He had created a perfect hell on earth. And the invaders had just taken their first step into its greedy maw. That step into the devil's frozen maw immediately turned into an endless march of the dead. While the nobles in the south of the continent warmed themselves by roaring fireplaces, here, in the wild north, the world's deadliest army was slowly freezing to death. The winter of 1475 struck with a vengeance. A piercing wind shrieked over the scorched wasteland, cutting through expensive cloth robes and seeping under heavy steel breastplates. It froze the very soul. The proud conquerors trudged heavily over the black snow. Their magnificent silk banners hung pathetically limp.
Their ceremonial horsetail standards were covered in a thick crust of murky ice. This was no longer the triumphal stride of a great empire. It was the monotonous, shuffling step of the doomed. Suleiman Pasha stubbornly drove his men forward. Blind imperial pride forbade him from admitting defeat to the weather and the void. Great Ottoman logistics collapsed instantly. The perfect military machine began to devour itself with a loud crunch. Instead of the hearty looting of flourishing cities, the soldiers faced savage animal hunger.
Stomachs cramped with painful spasms. Daily rations were cut to pathetic crumbs of rotten hardtack, and soon, even those vanished. Then came the terrible turn of the pack animals. Elegant Arabian steeds and hardy draft mules collapsed from exhaustion. No one tried to heal them. They were immediately put to the knife. Yesterday's elite warriors greedily tore at tough, semi-raw horseflesh with their teeth, hungrily drinking warm blood just to warm their frozen blue fingers for a minute. Try to feel this all-consuming cold. For a minute, become a simple janissary from distant, sun-drenched Anatolia. Your sturdy boots have long since worn through. You've wrapped your feet in filthy rags that quickly turned into blocks of ice. You stopped feeling your toes 3 days ago. Every wrong movement resonates with sharp, throbbing pain. Your breath freezes instantly on your cracked lips. You look at your haggard comrades. In their inflamed eyes, there is no longer a thirst for glory, only a murky, sticky fear of the white, endless silence. You cough with a dry, hacking bark. You clearly understand the brutal essence of the state. The great Sultan has simply forgotten about you. You are merely a dry digit in his endless lists of non-recoverable losses. Losses grew exponentially. The imperial bureaucrats of death were no longer recording newly conquered acres. They were grimly tallying frostbite statistics. Thousands of blackened limbs. Hundreds frozen to death in shallow snow pits during brief night halts. Dozens driven mad by the unrelenting white nightmare. Soon, a new, invisible, and merciless killer joined the frozen hell. Dysentery. Soldiers desperately drank filthy water, swallowing melted snow mixed with ash and the cadaverous poison of tainted wells. The disease mowed down the dense ranks faster than heavy cavalry. Mighty, proud warriors writhed pathetically in their own filth, dying of simple dehydration in the middle of a snow-covered plain. It was a shameful end to imperial grandeur. And then, from the dead forests, came a completely different kind of death. It was quiet and mathematically precise. Stephen's troops didn't come out for an honest, open fight. They worked like invisible surgeons methodically removing a foreign body. Guerrilla detachments dissolved instantly into the thick, frosty fog. A strike. The whistle of a thin arrow from the dark thicket. Done. The last rider in a long column falls silently into the deep snow. A strike. A sharp flash of gunpowder. A short, stifled scream. A forward scout disappears without a trace. The dark forests were literally crawling with hungry ghosts. The Ottomans sent strong, heavily armed punitive squads into the brush. They returned with nothing, or they didn't return at all. They were found much later, stripped, frozen, their throats neatly slit. This quickly drove the invaders insane. A mass paranoid psychosis covered the massive army like a thick, suffocating shroud. Every crooked snag looked like a deadly ambush. Every quiet rustle of a snow-covered branch triggered panicked firing into the void. A huge crowd of armed men was absolutely powerless against a handful of invisible shadows. The brutal strategy of 1,000 cuts worked perfectly. Stephen cold-bloodedly, drop by drop, bled the massive, lumbering beast. The beast roared in pain and total impotence, swinging its clawed paws blindly, only to strike the freezing, empty air. Suleiman Pasha was rapidly losing control over his invincible army. Iron discipline was melting much faster than the winter's snow. Hunger riots broke out spontaneously in one regiment after another. Officers brutally flogged the perpetually dissatisfied soldiers, and blood flowed like a river. But this didn't add any warm bread. The people's despair reached its critical peak. They desperately needed a general engagement, any physical target at all to vent their accumulated animal rage. The empire was in dire need of the saving illusion of control. The soldiers passionately yearned to see the elusive enemy face to face. They were ready to charge into the devil's very maw with a joyful cry, anything to end this agonizing, creeping torture of the unknown. It was at this moment of deep, absolute despair that the cunning Stephen made his next move. He slightly cracked open the heavy door to the underworld. The guerrillas suddenly ceased their nocturnal, hidden attacks. The winter forests grew suspiciously quiet. On the horizon, in the whitish, frosty haze, clear, dark silhouettes finally appeared. Moldovan forward units. They seemed to be breathing heavily, failing to retreat in time. They looked like incredibly easy, completely defenseless prey. The exhausted, starving Ottomans let out a hoarse, joyful howl. They saw the desired bait, the long-awaited chance for bloody revenge. None of them bothered to look closely at the terrain. No one realized exactly where these retreating shadows were luring them. Blind rage had completely shut down their reason. They ran with delight straight into a narrow, deadly valley. Only one road led into this narrow, deadly valley, a one-way road. Geography often becomes the ruthless co-author of great historical catastrophes. The valley of the Barlad River near the town of Vaslui was nothing like a classic battlefield for noble armies. Nature seemed to have specially molded a perfect, giant earthen coffin. Imagine a long, winding and damp corridor, tightly squeezed on two sides by high, incredibly steep hills. Their gentle slopes are densely overgrown with impenetrable, dark forest, where trees intertwine their bare branches like the skeletal fingers of dead men reaching for the gray sky. And at the very bottom of this natural corridor, there is no solid, reliable footing. A viscous, treacherous, and deep swamp stretches out there, cold winter mud, only slightly covered by a thin layer of ice and fluffy white snow. It was here, into this claustrophobic gut, that the 120,000-strong imperial army joyfully rushed. They ran forward with a frightening, animal enthusiasm. Behind them lay a whole month of humiliating hunger, weeks of endless frozen hell, and thousands of comrades dead from bloody diarrhea and deep frostbite. All this accumulated icy horror was suddenly transformed into blind, absolutely uncontrollable aggression. Ottoman commanders, once cold-blooded strategists, completely lost control of the situation and themselves. The famous iron discipline of the Sultan's troops evaporated like a light morning mist over a swamp. The exhausted soldiers saw before them only a pathetic handful of retreating Moldavian horsemen. The bait worked flawlessly. For an emaciated, half-dead janissary, this fleeing enemy wasn't just a military target. It was a warm hearth, a fatty piece of roasted meat, the final deliverance from the frozen torture. The survival instinct permanently disabled even basic tactical caution. Feel this intoxicating, deceptive thrill of the deadly chase. For 1 minute, become an experienced Rumelian rider. Your exhausted warhorse heaves and wheezes heavily beneath you, Thick white steam pours from its wide nostrils, freezing instantly in the cold. Your own frozen hands chafe against the stiff leather reins until they ache. You pay absolutely no attention to the fact that the cliffs on the right and left are relentlessly closing in. You don't see how the vital space for maneuver shrinks with every meter covered. Your dilated pupils are focused only on the gray wool cloaks of the fleeing Moldavians. You already anticipate the sweet, hot taste of blood. You are absolutely certain that the great empire has finally overtaken its pathetic, defiant victim. You joyfully draw your heavy, curved saber. In your ringing head, only one clear thought pulses: triumph. You don't even suspect that you are already merrily marching along the very bottom of your own giant grave. And on the hills, overgrown with thick forest, there was an absolute, paralyzing silence. 40,000 pairs of cold, calculating eyes froze there, motionless. Stephen's destitute army wasn't just passively waiting for the enemy. It was literally built into this ruthless landscape. The Moldovan prince never believed in blind military luck. He believed exclusively in the brutal, dispassionate mathematics of death. The Vaslui Valley had been prepared in advance with frightening, maniacal engineering precision. It was a true masterpiece of paranoid military art. At the bottom of the narrow valley, under an innocent layer of pure white snow, deep wolf pits waited patiently. At the bottom of each pit, dozens of sharp, fire-hardened oak stakes waited for their hour. The banks of the shallow Barlad River were skillfully flooded. Ordinary ground had turned into a bottomless, squelching quagmire, capable of swallowing a rider alive in seconds, along with a panicking horse in heavy steel armor. Stephen cold-bloodedly turned the natural terrain into massive, ruthless wooden millstones. Potential escape routes were already being blocked by the massive trunks of ancient trees, held by taut hemp ropes until the right moment. In the thick brush, at the perfect height for point-blank, lethal fire, the few artillery crews lay in wait. The bronze barrels of light cannons were packed tight with scrap metal, broken glass, and rusty nails. No noble, smooth cannonballs here, only the maximum sadistic kill radius for soft human tissue. This place was entirely unfit for a heroic nightly duel. It was an efficient conveyor belt for the methodical disposal of enemy manpower. Stephen the Great stood motionless atop a high hill. A thick, biting January fog clung to his dark traveling cloak. He looked down with a steady gaze, watching as the Ottoman army, a massive, multicolored serpent, slid slowly and surely into the narrow throat of the Valley of Death. He saw the first dense ranks of Janissaries joyfully quicken their pace, the heavy imperial cavalry following obediently behind. Endless columns of motley infantry packed themselves tight between the sheer stone cliffs. The proud empire was thrusting its arrogant head into a perfectly tightened noose, entirely of its own accord. The rumble of tens of thousands of marching feet merged into a single, monotonous, heavy roar. It echoed off the cold walls, amplifying again and again, creating an illusion of incredible power. But this power was nothing more than an optical illusion. The tension in the air had reached its peak, a tangible physical density. The air in the cramped valley grew thick, sticky, and heavy, like frozen molasses. Every passing moment stretched into an agonizing, ringing eternity. The Ottoman vanguard finally crossed the invisible, fatal point of no return. They had ventured so deep into the trap that the rear ranks physically could not stop. The colossal mass of humanity pressed relentlessly upon itself, forcing the invaders into a dense, sweaty, disoriented heap of flesh. The lead soldiers began to stumble over obstacles hidden beneath the snow. Exhausted horses began to snort nervously, their heavy hooves sinking into the frozen, sodden marsh. The deceptive, warm hope of a quick victory was melting fast. In its place, a primal, animal anxiety began to crawl in with cold, icy tentacles. Something here was fundamentally wrong. It was too quiet, too unbearably cramped, too much impenetrable fog ahead. Stephen slowly, smoothly raised his right hand. 40,000 of his soldiers held their breath in unison. There were no loud battle cries, no foolish clashing of weapons, only the ominous, barely audible creak of bowstrings and crossbows being drawn back. Only the dull, dry thud of lit wooden fuses hitting icy bronze cannon barrels. The trap had finally snapped shut on the illusion of another's weakness. The Empire had come to publicly punish a small, destitute country, but it had forgotten the primary rule of survival. A sheep that doesn't run from a wolf has likely painted a bright target on its own hide, just to lure the predator into a perfectly hidden trap. The Moldovan voivode's hand dropped sharply, like the falling blade of a guillotine. The hand dropped. The air shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces. The cold, gray valley instantly transformed into a blazing, cramped cauldron. The bronze barrels roared in one deafening voice, spitting tons of jagged metal into the thick of the living. A payload of rusty nails and broken glass struck the densely packed mass with savage force. This was no classic, noble duel. This was the cold, mechanical disposal of manpower. The projectiles didn't need to find a specific target. Missing was physically impossible. 120,000 men were trapped tight in a narrow earthen sack. Perfectly formed, beautiful army ranks ceased to exist in a single heartbeat. Imperial majesty collapsed into a muddy puddle with a loud, shameful splash. The invaders' greedy overconfidence was instantly replaced by primal, animal terror. Elite Janissary regiments tried to wheel around for an attack, stepping off the beaten path in unison. The white snow betrayed them, giving way under their heavy boots. Hidden, deep wolf pits greedily swallowed the front ranks, where sharpened oak stakes firmly anchored the impaled bodies. The rear ranks physically could not stop. The massive, blind crowd surged from behind, and soldiers hysterically trampled their fallen comrades in a desperate attempt to save themselves. But there was no salvation in this icy hell. The heavy imperial cavalry bolted in a panic toward the shallow river. The riders foolishly hoped to find a safe, solid ford, but the thin crust of ice cracked loudly. The treacherous, intentionally flooded marsh instantly sucked down hundreds of powerful horses. Expensive steel armor quickly turned into a deadly, unbearable anchor. The pride of the great Sultan wallowed helplessly in the freezing, sucking muck. Discipline died on the spot. The great army turned into a panicking, screaming biomass. Men blindly crushed one another, choking hopelessly on the murky water and suffocating in the acrid, thick gunpowder smoke. For one brief minute, imagine you are a veteran of the Ottoman Guard. You have marched through dozens of successful, victorious campaigns. Now you are waist-deep in freezing, sticky mud. To your left, a wounded horse screams wildly and piercingly. To your right, the lifeless body of your commander falls heavily upon you. You frantically try to raise your sharp scimitar, but you simply don't have the space to swing it. You are pinned from all sides by your own brothers in arms, driven mad by fear. Their faces, distorted by animal terror, blur into a single filthy smear. There is a catastrophic lack of air. You are slowly suffocating in the uncontrollable panic of the faceless crowd. Your magnificent, years-long training is now utterly useless. Geography has proven far more powerful than any brilliant tactic. But Süleyman Pasha refused to give up just like that. The stubborn old commander tried to pull the remnants of his will into a steel fist. He screamed desperately at his terrified officers until he was hoarse, throwing his last, most precious reserve into a hopeless frontal assault. A massive wall of men swayed heavily forward. By some miracle, they stepped over the first deep trenches, literally marching over the still warm bodies of their dead soldiers. For a moment, it seemed that colossal numerical superiority would break this clever trap, that the raw, blunt mass would push through this narrow corridor of death. The tension reached its ringing critical limit. Icy horror began to give way to fanatical rage. And at that very turning point, nature dealt its final, treacherous blow. A thick, impenetrable fog crawled rapidly down from the high hills. Visibility instantly dropped to near zero. The chaos became absolute. And then, a long, vibrating roar erupted from the dark, snow-covered forests. Dozens of heavy, brass war horns began to sing. Stephen cold-bloodedly played his final trump card. The heavy Moldavian cavalry struck the flanks with crushing force. They emerged from the white shroud like massive steel ghosts, slamming into the overextended, defenseless sides of the Ottoman host at full speed. Impact. The whistle of long lances. Period. This powerful, mathematically calculated ram finally broke the spine of the imperial machine. The flank attacks easily sliced the massive army into helpless, isolated fragments. Landscape and precise calculation completely defeated blind pride. The invaders lost contact with one another. Commanders could no longer see their subordinates. Soldiers could no longer hear the orders that might have saved them. A total, irreversible paralysis of command set in. The giant, lumbering beast thrashed pitifully in its filthy death throes. The invincible army turned back in a frenzy. But this was no longer an organized, strategic retreat. It was a wild, insane stampede. Men threw down their heavy weapons in a panic and tore off their expensive, gold-adorned armor. They tried to flee as fast as possible across the slippery, blood-soaked ground. Without the slightest regret, they maimed their fellow soldiers for a single tiny scrap of open space. Stephen the Great had achieved his brutal goal. He cynically proved one simple truth to the world. Even 100,000 heroes, armed to the teeth, easily turn into a squealing herd if you pull the ground out from under them in time. The Empire left its sacred honor in this frozen, foul-smelling quagmire forever. The filthy, stinking quagmire was left far behind, but something far more terrifying awaited the fugitives ahead. The massive, once invincible army had finally ceased to exist. It shattered into tens of thousands of shivering individuals, driven insane by animal terror. The phase of absolute, methodical mopping up began. No noble pursuits with proudly fluttering banners, no beautiful chivalry toward a defeated foe. This action was no longer called war. The Moldavians themselves contemptuously dubbed this time the pig hunt. And they were absolutely right. The proud imperial warriors were cold-bloodedly driven into the deep woods like common, crazed livestock. The victors felt no hot rage. They were simply doing their grim, routine work. The frozen forests quickly turned into a giant slaughterhouse without a single drop of mercy. Light detachments of local cavalry followed the bloody trail tirelessly. They did not seek to take noble prisoners for a rich ransom, nor did they listen to desperate pleas for mercy. Cold metal descended rhythmically onto defenseless necks. Strike. The dull thud of a falling body. Period. Next. Stephen had given a perfectly clear, laconic order. Eradicate the threat at the very root. The ruler had mastered the cruel law of geopolitics perfectly. An enemy spared today will never become your grateful friend. He will simply hide, lick his wounds, and gather a new, even more ferocious punitive army. He will surely come back for your head. Therefore, the disposal process proceeded with frightening mathematical precision. Yesterday's farmers busily dragged stiffened corpses into deep ravines. Their native forest had to be completely purged of foreign refuse. Feel this sticky, paralyzing fear of the victim. For one moment, become the one desperately trying to escape. Your lungs burn with fire from endless running through deep snow. Bare branches lash painfully across your frostbitten face. You lost your heavy helmet and expensive scimitar long ago. You haven't eaten for several long days. Behind your back, the snow crunches constantly, monotonously. Those are the heavy hooves of your pursuers. You hide behind the wide trunk of an old oak. You press your hands over your mouth with all your might, filthy, trembling hands. You try to stifle your loud, wheezing breath. Your heart pounds wildly, ready to burst through your ribs. You hear the calm, businesslike voices of the hunters. They are discussing their routine affairs. They speak of you not as a man. To them, you are just a wild beast, a filthy animal. The barking of dogs sounds closer. They have set hungry hounds on the scent. You slowly slide down the rough bark onto the frozen ground. You understand clearly. This is the absolute, inevitable end. The flight lasted for 3 long, agonizing days. Nature seemed to have decided to finish off the arrogant invaders once and for all. New, unprecedented January frosts struck. But more terrifying than any frost were those who suddenly emerged from deep caves and forest hideouts. The peasants themselves. The people whose homes Stephen had forced to be burned to the ground. They didn't go to seek revenge on their harsh ruler. Instead, they poured all their accumulated black hatred onto the retreating Ottomans. Armed with blunt axes, pitchforks, and simple heavy stones, they stepped silently out of the thick fog. The empire's perfect military machine proved utterly defenseless against this spontaneous, primal malice. Proud officers died from heavy blows of rusty scythes. This was no glorious death on the field of battle. This was the most shameful end possible in a filthy snowdrift. No one escaped this blind peasant justice. Stephen watched this process with frightening composure. His exhausted generals joyfully reported thousands of destroyed enemies. They brought huge bundles of captured banners and piled up gold ornaments. But there was not a shadow of a joyful smile on the ruler's face. He understood the essence of what was happening with crystal clarity. This was not a great, shining victory of good over evil. It was merely a necessary, incredibly filthy, sanitary thinning. He was simply clearing his territory of dangerous weeds. The mathematics of war were absolutely relentless. 40,000 dead Ottomans would remain lying in these frozen forests forever. The exact number of enemy losses mattered little. Only the final result mattered. The imperial machine had suffered its most terrible, irreparable loss. It had lost its sacred myth of invincibility. But this grim technological disposal left behind only a vast, scorched void. The forests were packed with dead bodies. The earth was heavily soaked with the blood of both stranger and kin. The villages continued to lie in black ruins. The victors stood quietly in the middle of a boundless, icy cemetery. The pig hunt had ended successfully. The last scream had faded forever in the dark thicket. A dull, heavy silence fell. And in this dead silence, another, far more cynical reality
clearly emerged. Stephen looked slowly at the mangled horizon, toward where, amidst the ash and ice, an endless cycle of nightmare was being born. This endless cycle of nightmare was only beginning. A dull, heavy silence hung over the mangled Moldavia. A thick white shroud slowly covered the battlefield. Nature mercifully hid the traces of the greatest human meat grinder of the 15th century. Word of the incredible, absolutely impossible rout of the Sultan's army flew rapidly to the west. It easily crossed the snow-capped Carpathians and quickly reached the warm palaces of arrogant Europe. The enlightened world froze in hypocritical, sugary delight.
Pope Sixtus IV hastily wrote long, pompous letters, solemnly proclaiming the Moldovan voivode a true athlete of Christ, a defender of the Holy Faith, the primary savior of European civilization. Venetian doges joyfully raised heavy goblets of expensive ruby wine. The Hungarian king breathed a sigh of relief in his impregnable, safe castle. By someone else's calloused hands, on someone else's frozen land, with someone else's thick blood, the steel imperial steamroller had been suddenly stopped. Europe stood and applauded loudly. But she did not send a single armed soldier to help. She did not give a single gold coin to rebuild the country burned to the ground. High politics always remains a cynical, calculating whore. Look at this geopolitical triumph from the inside. For a second, become an exhausted Moldovan scribe in Stephen's cold field tent. Your thin fingers have long since turned black from acrid soot and ingrained ink. You hold a beautiful, crisp parchment from Rome. It is richly decorated with gold leaf and smells pleasantly of Eastern incense. But beyond the thin, frozen fabric of the tent, your dying, scorched homeland groans dully. There is no food there. There are no warm homes. Thousands of hungry, mangled orphans wander blindly. You read aloud, monotonously, the beautiful, loud words about the great salvation of all Christendom. But you feel only the bitter, nauseating taste of fresh ash on your tongue. Elegant diplomatic letters will not replace slaughtered livestock. The heavy wax seals of allies will not resurrect tens of thousands of frozen peasants. Stephen the Great stood motionless in the middle of this boundless field of the dead. He did not celebrate the victory. He did not drink tart wine from captured chalices. He had no saving illusions left. The pragmatic, cold mind of a brilliant ruler saw the grim future with crystal clarity. He had crushed a giant army. He had publicly shamed the greatest conqueror of the age before the eyes of a stunned world. Mehmed II had received a stinging, humiliating slap in the face. But the voivode understood the relentless mathematics of endless war perfectly. The massive Ottoman Empire had not collapsed from one terrible blow. The Sultan had lost tens of thousands of elite fighters. For tiny Moldavia, that would have meant total, final death. The destitute country would have simply vanished from the political maps forever. But for a colossal, wealthy empire, it was merely an annoying, minor scratch on thick steel armor. A light, preventative bloodletting. The pedantic sultanic bureaucracy of death would simply open new, perfectly clean ledgers. Faceless recruiters would busily take fresh, hungry recruits from distant Anatolia. Skilled blacksmiths would tirelessly forge new, heavy bronze cannons. Ringing copper coins would flow in a continuous river into the greedy pockets of new mercenaries. the empire would inevitably return. Impact. The empire is simply duty-bound to wash away its shame. Period. Stephen had not won the final war of good against evil. He had won only a short, incredibly expensive reprieve from his own execution. And he had paid for this tiny moment of silence with absolutely everything. The state had turned into a smoking, charred skeleton. The entire weak economy had been completely destroyed by his own hands for the sake of a flawless, scorched earth strategy. The surviving, exhausted peasants had nothing left to sow in soil saturated with the poison of corpses. Herein lies the most terrifying, paradoxical secret of the survival of small nations. The freedom of an independent state is always only a temporary, fragile illusion. It exists only as long as you can prove to a massive predator the absolute, mathematical unprofitability of your conquest. Stephen proved this harshly to the whole world. He made the price of conquering his land absurd, prohibitively high. But to save Moldavia from another's ruthless slavery, he first turned it into a lifeless, gray wasteland himself. Some rulers built high stone walls to naively hold back encroaching death. Others diligently forged sharp swords to ruthlessly deliver it. But all illusions proved powerless before the cold, numbing pragmatism of a lone man ready to kill his own world for the sake of saving it. In this eternal historical meat grinder, there are no true heroes in shining armor. There are only survivors, those who were the very first to slit the throat of their own conscience. And now, standing on the smoking ruins of human morality and common sense, answer yourself with total honesty. If the only reliable way to save your home is to cold-bloodedly burn it down along with all its inhabitants, is this great freedom even worth its monstrous price?